Yes, thank you.
Okay,
That's
well,
okay.
greetings from Snowdonia on this rainy afternoon. So, thank you, John. Thank you, Francis, Daniel, Ruth, and all the teams. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mark Rendell. I'm from Step Change Design. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But the title for the presentation I want to share with you over the next 20 minutes, it's called Relationship-Centered Design. And as John was hinting at there, this is the approach that we make at Step Change Design when we're working with care settings, particularly for the residents living with a dementia, in the way that they engage with their outside spaces. The subhead on here is aiming for inclusive outside spaces. And I really want us to just home in on the word aiming, because I'm going to suggest in this presentation that it's not completely in the gift of a designer or architect or other outside specialist that we on our own can create inclusive outside spaces in this context. So hopefully more will become clear as I talk us through the argument for this. So who are Step Change Design? Well, there's two of us. This is my colleague, Debbie Carroll. We're both garden designers. We both have our garden design businesses. We came together because we had both noticed the same thing. We had begun to hear about care home gardens that had been redesigned, often to the latest design guidance, but over a short period of time, that hadn't necessarily translated into greater engagement or more activation of the space around these care settings for the residents. And so Debbie and I were kind of troubled by that, because we were wondering if we designers had overlooked something. Was there something missing in our practice that had resulted in that outcome? So we decided in 2013 we would carry out a small-scale research project. We were going to fund it ourselves, and after contacting NAPA, the National Activity Providers Association, who are an amazing charity, this research project grew into what we understand to be one of the largest projects of its kind to observe interaction levels between people living with a dementia in a residential care setting and their outside spaces. So we started with 24 care homes across England and Wales in that study. There's more information about this on our website. I'll leave a link at the end, or Francis might put one up. The key finding I want to share with you this afternoon, because I'll be talking about it in much more detail in terms of the inclusivity argument, we discovered that there was a correlation between the care culture in operation in that setting and engagement levels with the garden. So in other words, the more advanced the care culture, the more they were engaging their residents with the outside space naturally as a part of meeting the needs of their residents as individuals. And this is an important characteristic to understand. So we then decided that we would kind of be slightly unusual. We would create a diagnostic tool, a method for engaging both care settings and outside specialists in grappling with this subtle phenomenon called culture, because it's not an easy thing to see. So if you don't mind, I'm going to now just be kind of clear about what we understand by culture, because I've just mentioned it twice in terms of care culture. So I think it's important to have a kind of a working definition. And this really is the base point for my presentation, having an understanding of what we mean by this. So here are some bullet points that kind of expound on what we mean. It is a complex and subtle area of organizational practice and behavior. Any person who's undergone a culture change activity knows that it demands a lot from everyone involved, because we're talking about having to amend and adjust previously well-embedded routines and habits. Culture actually is another way, if you want to simplify it, it's another way of saying, this is the way we do things here. So a care setting down that end of the street will have a different care culture from a care setting at the other end of the street, simply because they do things differently. So what is it? What are the ingredients of culture that are laid down in this subtle area? Well, they are things like processes and procedures. They might be the things that you have a policy statement about as you walk into reception. They're also the routines and habits, and if you like, the normative behavior of what we do every day. They are also the rules and regulations. They are things like your values and priorities. So this care home values this aspect of their care setting. This care setting values those aspects. They are also where you find the beliefs and attitudes laid down in that care culture itself. So previous employees or managers can leave down influences within the culture itself. So all of these things are, if you like, laid down into the subconscious of the care setting. They are things we need to learn rapidly to become competent about. So they're things that are second nature. The habits and routines of delivering the care become things we no longer think about. Now, the thing is, as we discovered, if we want to find out why a care setting isn't using their garden as much as we think they should, the answer is going to be down in here somewhere, under the bonnet of the care setting. What habits and routines had become embedded that stopped the care setting from engaging with that space? So that's why we home in on understanding what kind of care culture is at work with our client group. So it is difficult to see when you're in it. So the culture change journey is actually reversing that process of getting things into our subconscious and second nature, bringing them up for review. So which habits do we want to change? Which beliefs and attitudes are holding us back from engaging with the outside space? So we don't underestimate the challenge and the stamina required of a culture change journey. But the map tool I just alluded to in the previous slide was our best offer to make care culture explicit and tangible, something you can talk about and discuss with other members in the teams. Okay, so if we had a working definition of culture, what's our understanding of inclusivity? So for Debbie and I at Step Change Design, I want to share this basic understanding of a term that we hear quite a lot of. So if we look at the context of engaging residents living with a dementia with their outside space, then I want to propose that inclusivity is part of a team of concepts. So on this screen, I've included relational concepts that go with inclusivity, called equality, equity, and diversity. What I've included here for people is, if you like, what would be a kind of a statement that might illustrate what we mean. So for inclusivity, this might be a sentence that you might read: no one is excluded from the opportunity to go outside. A statement that might illustrate and expand on the equality mindedness of the organization might say something like, everyone has the right to engage with the outside space. In terms of looking for evidence of an equitability concept, we might see a statement that says something like, we recognize that some people will need additional support to engage meaningfully with the outside space. And then the last of the concepts that connect here, diversity, we might see a statement that says something like, the outside space will be a meaningful experience for residents, staff, and families. Now, within this grouping, there are pairs. So if you like, for us, inclusivity and equality are the high-level endpoint outcomes that an organization is aiming for. That we are using collective terms or universal terms like everybody, all, and the opposite of no one. And I want to propose that the other pair on the other side of the screen, equity and diversity, are, if you like, the processes, the engines by which you try and achieve the vision statements of inclusivity and equality. I want to also just draw attention to the bolded words there, meaningfully and meaningful, because they become quite important in a moment when I explain a bit more about care culture. For something to be meaningful, means it has to have relevance to that group or that individual. For it to have relevance, we need to understand enough about that subgroup or that individual in order to meet that need of meaningful occupation or engagement. So there has to be a level of awareness and curiosity about these target groups, client groups, and individuals. So what I'm wanting to say here is that these two processes are also what we would expect to find under the bonnet of the care setting in its cultural hot pot. So what I'm proposing here is that in order for us as designers and outside specialists and architects working with care settings, we have a role to support the inclusivity of an organization. We can work out how well they are on that journey through seeing how well these processes of equity and diversity are being supported within the organization. So that kind of feeds into the kind of sort of warning that I was offering at the beginning, that we can aim for it, but the motor of change we have to look for within the care setting itself, so that we facilitate and support the increasing inclusivity of the care setting itself. So, okay, I can hear now, it's like, well, that's fine, but how do we find out how these processes are being supported in the care setting itself? And that's where I want to introduce you to our map tool that we produce. As I mentioned earlier, this is, if you like, a manifestation in a two-dimensional form of what we believe the mosaic of care culture is. We were very lucky in our research that we had a very wide spectrum of care setting cultures to observe and to work with. What we started to notice is that there was a spectrum of care across our cohort group, from task-oriented care, which we place towards the bottom of this map tool, all the way through person-centered care, which was a kind of a flip point around the center of the map, towards very advanced care practices that we called relationship-centered care. So there are other things going on when we understand that care settings have their own culture and they are then on a spectrum between these points. We have, if you like, extra data, extra survey information about our client that helps us to match the support we can provide. And in step change design, we also promote the idea to think wider than our immediate role or task of creating a new space. That may not be required, first of all. So I'm just going to click through this to illustrate it a little bit more. So what we're proposing here on this map tool is that basically the care settings journey is towards more advanced care practices. There are lots of benefits for everyone in improving the care culture of the organization. What we observed when we were developing and analyzing our data was that also this journey to more progressive care is actually a journey from an institutional feel within an organization where the system rules. The idea of being able to negotiate and compromise around the rules and regulations are kind of harder to achieve. And at the top of this care culture map and the spectrum, we saw homes, care setting environments that were very much like the home environment, expressions of love and care, of understanding who they were with, of the residents really being treated very much as individuals. So towards the lower end of our spectrum, there was, if you like, much more tendency to go outside in groups, to do group-based timetabled activities. Correspondingly, for those homes practicing more advanced care culture practices, we could see much more spontaneity around engaging with the outside space. There was a seamlessness and an ease of sort of transitioning across that threshold. And also there was a much bigger focus on the resident as an individual, of remaining curious and alert to changes in things like physical ability, mobility, or cognition. So there are, if you like, qualitative shifts. And the shift really occurs around the person-centered area of the map. Once a care setting has engaged in the center areas of this map, they are, if you like, looking at what becomes meaningful for our residents as individuals. So it's that word meaningful again. So we're having evidence that those processes of equity and diversity, which will drive a home towards becoming inclusive, are much more in evidence and much more supported in care homes which are traveling further up the spectrum. Correspondingly, for those homes that are further down the spectrum, those processes of equity and diversity are challenged by other things like exclusivity or conditionality around going outside. There might be more alarm-based doors or keypad coded ways of going outside. There might be also things like mismatches between open door policies and what they believe they can achieve. There might be more permission-based processes to achieve further down. The other thing we noticed was there was greater fearfulness around health and safety rules, regulations, and some mythology too. So I'm positioning this that by understanding the care culture of our clients, if we're working with care setting clients, gives us a very big clue as to the degree to which we can support their desire to become inclusive. So I mentioned at the beginning relationship-centered design, and this is how Debbie and I now work with care settings as a result of the research that we carried out in 2013. And it's fair to say that we are not the same designers that we were when we went into this. We thought the answer to getting more residents outside was something to do with the garden or the design. We very quickly realized if we had no appreciation of the care culture, those habits that resulted in the garden not being used are so powerful that unless we address them at the same time as the problems, then a new garden is likely to revert back to being underused after a period of time. So what we would say is the basic outline of relationship-centered design is to really understand this extra piece of information about your client. It's great to be surveying and understanding the assets and problems in the outside space, but you need to understand more about the phenomenon of the care culture. The care setting is the expert, not us. They know what their residents want. If we find that the data we're obtaining from them doesn't seem to relate to them as individuals, we can ask for more of that. Also, we're kind of aware that if it's about supporting a care setting's journey up the spectrum to more progressive care, it's likely to involve us in smaller interactions over a longer period of time. So we're moving away from that red ribbon and scissors activity of a brand new garden. Here you are. It's more likely about helping to overcome problems that have got in the way of the care setting from engaging even more meaningfully and actively with their space. The critical thing really is that the outside space really must remain flexible and adaptable. Cohort changes within a care setting are happening at quite a rapid rate. So what might be meaningful and engaging and activating for one resident or a set may not be the same for future residents. So having that sense of flexibility and adaptability is quite a useful thing to bear in mind when we're working with the care setting. So, okay, I've been talking about these higher performing outside spaces, and I've been proposing that because their culture is very supportive of these processes of equity and diversity, what do they look like in practice? What are all of us as outside specialists aiming for with our care setting clients? These are some of the characteristics that we observed in our research project. It's normal to use the garden on most days of the year. These are homes that don't use the weather as an excuse not to go out. They adjust and adapt. Okay, so we would hear stories of residents walking around in the snow, in the rain. We also have an infographic poster that can encourage care settings to not be put off by the weather. Residents are engaging with the garden meaningfully, enjoying activities there as and when they choose to do them. That's what we observed with the highest performing homes. That is evidence of inclusivity already there as a working definition. I mentioned about the outside space remaining flexible and adaptable. And one of the shocks for us as designers was in the most successful gardens, they were actually very bland and very ordinary, and they certainly weren't perfect. Some of these homes had slight gradients in their paths. Some of them had lumpy lawns. When we drilled down more deeply, they were used as measuring devices. They could work out what the cognitive capacity or the physical mobility needs were of their residents through the imperfections. Now, this was quite challenging for us at the beginning. Also, we must also look at the way that health and safety evolves up that spectrum from being very fearful to actually having a much more balanced view of risk assessment. So it's balancing the risks that might accrue to that resident with the benefits that they also know will accrue to them. And to evolve a much more progressive health and safety sort of process really demands that we understand our residents as individuals. We replace the fear and the doubts with actual information about what they're capable of doing. So it's an ongoing, constant remaining curious and updating themselves about what their residents as individuals are capable and wish to do. So in a sense, the other thing to actually ask here is to turn the tables on we outside specialists, and also to sort of ask, what is our culture as designers or architects? If we are given a brief from a care setting client saying, I want keypads and alarms on all these doors, how many of us will then say, can you give me more information about why you wish to do that? Because it's an exclusive request. Or does it fall into that blind spot where we think, yes, yes, absolutely, we must make sure. So I'm also proposing back to us as a sector that how inclusive are we in our cultures? Do we support homes reaching this kind of goal, or are we holding them back? So in a way, as much as it's about understanding that subtle phenomenon of culture in care settings, I'm also wanting us to shine a mirror and pose a mirror back to ourselves and say, what about our own practices? Are we more fearful of health and safety than our care setting clients? So it's important to pay attention to our clients and those subtle practices of beliefs and values and attitudes, as much to work out how we will support them in going forward and doing our best to make sure we don't keep them back. So that was just a very, very brief kind of summary of one aspect of the way that we approach our work at Step Change Design in terms of working with care setting clients. We are developing a designer handbook specifically around this based on our care culture map. And I'd just be delighted to carry on a conversation with anyone who wishes to find out more afterwards. Here's the ways that you can reach us. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. Really appreciate it.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. And that was a fascinating take on I love the idea of the care culture spectrum. And as you were saying, you're from landscape design. I'm as an architect, and the physical nature of developing spaces and developing design versus actually what we always describe as the platform of the spaces and the places for the social interaction of people and for the enjoyment of life. So we recreate the stage, but actually understanding how people will perform on that stage is crucial as well. So thank you for that. And I think while you've been talking, Francis has been sending information through on some of the information you provided, and there's also a very interesting link on the, excuse my pronunciation, the Hogvik Dementia Village, which somebody has raised as well as being a very interesting precedent for the approach that can be taken to dementia-friendly design. I would also like to thank Sally for looking for the links to your initial research, which has also been posted while you've been talking. Alison made a very interesting point about considering the cultural barriers to engagement. And I think that's very important as well, and the idea of understanding people's own lives and where people have come from in those settings. So both the ethos and culture of the setting, but also of those people who are resident in the settings. I'm not actually seeing at the moment particular questions coming through for you, but I would like to also ask you what your thoughts are, what we're finding as we're developing settings which include the idea of this community engagement and neighbourhood engagement. How you think we can encourage the broader outside space to become a part of people's lives as well. Do you have any thoughts around that in terms of your research?
Yes, in fact, that was another characteristic of higher performing homes. They were very outward looking and engaging with the local community. So you would have, if you like, they would offer their space for the local dog show or for the tea parties. There would be visits and engagement with the local community. And so, for example, things like going out to post letters and going out to the local cafes, in a way, because the orientation of homes as they progress further up the care culture spectrum is to meet the needs and wishes of their residents, their stance is, well, how do we make this happen? Yeah. And because alongside that, health and safety has been addressed with the sense of balancing the benefits that accrue from doing it, you've got a much better way of carrying out a risk assessment process. And the crucial thing there is understanding your residents as individuals.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that understanding is key. Also, just that in terms of actually that broader experience of the neighbourhood and people and organisations such as Sarah Lewis talking about the idea of planning becoming involved, because we know now, all of us from COVID, that actually places to sit in the neighbourhood is really, really important. The idea of pocket parks or small spaces, they don't have to be big spaces, but they can be places where those opportunities for relationships can be developed. And I would love to see that as part of what comes beyond COVID, is our better understanding of the characteristics of it, outdoor space, really. Just one other point as well, because it's fascinating you've done this research. We're also asked to look at the idea of creating place for multi-generational use, for families to engage with residents as well. Have you picked up on any of that at all?
Yeah, I mean, the way that families engage with their family members who are in the care setting, it goes back to that point about flexibility and adaptability, really. One thing we found during our research project is some of the most popular homes that people wanted to be in were those that overlook playgrounds or the street. So it's really getting away from the idea that we have to keep people away. It's actually the most popular rooms in some of these homes are those that see the toing and froing, the constant kind of street life that's going on. And in one home, we would find people were sat outside the front of the care setting itself, greeting everyone. And we could see that they did this almost daily, because the milkman, the kind of sandwich person, all these people coming in knew these people sat there by name. So we knew that this was a habitual activity. So back then, because of some of the conditioning that we had received as designers, we were horrified that all this was going on outside the front of a care setting. So it goes back to that point that we have to address our cultural blockages, perhaps, or assumptions or conditioning. If we're going to work effectively, we need to understand where our care setting clients are so that we don't keep them back.
Absolutely. And just to pick up also a point that Alison made around the opportunity for people's reconditioning in private or public, well-designed external space post-COVID. We've all got to re-engage with this, and we've all got to understand how there is that. That's a great phrase that's being used in terms of that reconditioning for private and public space. So there are going to be some very important sort of small steps that we take as we emerge from our tiny worlds into the bigger world as well. Thank you very much for that, Mark. That was fascinating, and I'm sure people will want to carry on chats with Mark, and he's prompted a lot of links to things. Stephen has put through a very interesting piece about a memory cafe in Plymouth, which includes some dementia-friendly parking. And I think we really want to try and sort of gain as much as we can of understanding the successes of some of these interventions, so we can actually present them as designers, but also as the residents, in terms of seeing what can actually be making a broader and a more accessible world for relationships to be developed. Thank you again, Mark.